My guest at this time is Ilan Berman, Senior Vice President at the American Foreign Policy Council. He joins us today to discuss the ongoing crisis in Venezuela, the Trump administration's strong stance in support of Juan Guaido and against the regime of Nicolas Maduro, and why the Russians are getting involved there. And Ilan, thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, great to be back.
The Trump administration is very clear in asserting that Maduro has lost legitimacy and that Guaido is the rightful interim president until new elections can be held. What do you make of the policy and how strongly it's being expressed?
Well, I think it's a good declaratory policy. The problem is just because we say it doesn't make it so. And the Maduro regime has proven to be remarkably resilient in holding on to power in Venezuela, even though the Venezuelan economy is in this death spiral, even though increasingly you're seeing persistent protests out in the street. The Maduro regime has the upper hand in terms of the ability to use force. The military hasn't really fragmented, at least not yet. And they've proven remarkably resilient. So the administration, which had, I think, very high hopes, at least initially, that their support of Guaido, their backing of the democratic opposition to Maduro would be enough to push the conversation over the edge, really to tilt the balance of power in favor of the Democrats and against Maduro. They're finding that it's turning out to be a little bit harder than they thought initially.
So other than championing Guaido and applying sanctions, what is the Trump administration prepared to do here?
Well, I think that's really the open question. And there are some here around town that are talking about the need to put our money where our mouth is, to not only provide military assistance, although that's an option, but also potentially even to intervene militarily in favor of the democratic forces. That's an enormously controversial step. And it's also a step that others, not only the Maduro regime, but others like Russia are taking seriously. The Russian move in just the last few days to insert over 100 military troops as advisors to the Maduro regime is a function of that. It's a function of the fact that the Kremlin is afraid that the U.S. is going to back up its rhetorical support with concrete military support, and they're trying to head us off at the pass.
What is Russia's goal here? Why are they in this on Maduro's side?
Well, the Russians are in this for a number of reasons. First of all, they really prefer the anti-American status quo in Latin America. It's not a secret that Central and South America for a long time has been less than a permissive environment for American values and American policy. It's had a whole bunch of anti-American regimes that have proliferated south of our border. And these are regimes like the ones in Venezuela, regimes like the one in Ecuador and in Bolivia, that have proven, as a result of their anti-Americanism, to be very cozy and very chummy with the Russian government, with the Chinese government, with the Iranian government, for example. So clearly the Russians have an ally in the Maduro regime, and they don't want that ally to fall. But more importantly, the Russians increasingly are moving around in the Western Hemisphere. They're carrying out long-range bomber flights the way they did during the Cold War, and they're becoming more and more interested as they stretch their wings, more and more interested in their ability to put down roots in Latin America. And they don't want us to prevent them from being able to do that. So they have a stake in maintaining the status quo in Venezuela.
Doesn't sound like you think that Trump telling them to get out is going to quite do the trick here.
No, I don't think it'll do the trick. The real question to me is how serious the White House is, because what the Russians have done very clearly is a provocative gesture, and they're calling the administration's bluff. The Russians are positioning themselves in Venezuela and essentially challenging the United States to push them out. If we decide to do that, that is a pretty dramatic escalation of tensions with Russia on the one hand, and of the hostilities that are taking place south of our border on the other. I don't know if this administration is really hurtling headlong into competition, into great power competition with Russia in our own hemisphere, but the Russians have certainly set the table to make that possible.
What's the smartest way to approach this, at least initially, the Russian antagonism here?
Well, I think it's a good question, and I think for the United States to double down on pro-American governments in Latin America including potentially through the positioning of troops there. Countries like Colombia, for example, which is next to Venezuela, is, I think, important. It's prudent. It shores up America's regional allies. It shows them that we're paying attention. It shows them that they're not left to their own devices and that we've essentially pulled out of the region. But beyond that, support for democratic forces, both in Venezuela specifically and in the region more broadly, is, I think, crucially important because the Russians are in Venezuela because it's a hospitable environment for them there. The more we support the political liberals, the more we support democratic activists, the less likely they are to feel like Venezuela is a comfortable home base.
We're talking with Ilan Berman, Senior Vice President at the American Foreign Policy Council. And Ilan, I don't think it would be too much of a stretch to say that after going on 18 years in Afghanistan and still feeling the effects of 8 years in Iraq, that a lot of Americans might not have much of a stomach for U.S. direct involvement militarily in Venezuela. I don't know if you have a different opinion on that. But before we even get to that, what is the best way to express what U.S. interests are in Venezuela? Why does this matter to us so much?
Well, I think those are actually connected questions. Certainly, the American people are tired of foreign entanglements, and there's not a lot of appetite for us being involved in Latin America. And there's even less involvement than usual for us to be involved in Latin America because we've done such a poor job over the last several years, over the last couple of administrations, talking about why Latin America is so important. The American people as a whole think of Latin America as America's geopolitical backyard, but also as the source of illegal immigration or drugs and crime. They don't really think more fulsomely about the importance of Latin America for our country's security and the importance of strong, stable, accountable regimes there for peace in our hemisphere. And because we really haven't devoted a lot of time and thinking to those ideas, they've allowed the weak and corrupt regimes there to proliferate, right? When we don't have a stake, nature abhors a vacuum, and the vacuum is filled by anti-American regimes and by near peers or by aspiring global superpowers like Russia, like China, like Iran that support them.
Very interesting. A couple quick questions before we let you go. First of all, how much do we really know about Juan Guaido? Are we sure he'd be a whole lot better?
Well, I think it's clear that he would be better than Nicholas Maduro in the sense that Nicholas Maduro is a known quantity. He is the successor for Hugo Chavez, who was this radical leftist revolutionary strongman that made common cause with the radical regime in Iran, that essentially opened Venezuela's borders to all manner of radical elements. So we know that Maduro is not good. Guaido seems to be a good deal better, although his government does have quite a bit of proximity to sort of more socialist, more communist ideas. And it doesn't mean that it wouldn't be a qualitative improvement to what you have in Venezuela now. But this is, I think, a really useful question for us to think about when we think about transition in Venezuela. We need to sort of keep an eye on their political trajectory there.
And finally, what's the next thing you look for to tell you how this is going to play out?
Well, I think, to me, the most important dynamic is the dynamic that's now happening between the White House and the Kremlin. Russia has quite clearly thrown down the gauntlet. It believes that the United States is not serious in its Venezuela policy and that the U.S. isn't going to do much to kick Russia out of the Western Hemisphere. So this is decision time for the White House, for the Trump administration. We are at a moment where we need to really decide how serious we are in terms of promoting change in Venezuela, and beyond that, what our Latin America policy is. Because if you choose not to decide, if you choose not to have a Latin America policy, you've already made a choice. You've made a choice that allows Russia to enter and Russia to run the table. Very interesting. We'll keep watching, and hopefully we'll have you back soon. Ilan, thanks very much for your time today. My pleasure. Ilan Berman, Senior Vice President at the American Foreign Policy Council. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.